I want to emphasize, like, we're not talking about just removing the freeway and like creating a vacuum. People would still be able to drive. I think that's really important. Like, there would still be multiple lanes of traffic to move
I'm
along.
so reassured, Alex. You've
Yeah, I
reassured
know.
me.
It's
Multiple lanes
crazy.
of car traffic still?
Multiple
There's
lanes of car traffic. Well, here's the
That's
thing.
something
Like,
for everyone.
even on the smallest segments of the I-94 trench, it's like a football field long. And in some places, it's much bigger, which means you have the opportunity, like the community really has the opportunity to make it what it wants.
We're rolling. We're rolling.
This is a real thing. Real thing.
None of you have the balls to stop this. Stop this.
I've got plenty of time. I have nothing else going on today.
We're in the Wedge neighborhood right now.
This is the Wedge Live podcast. I'm your host, John Edwards. And today, a special episode. I was scolded about the title of the episode. I wanted to call it The War on 94 because I think a lot of people would listen to a podcast episode called The War on 94. But Jose from Our Streets, Minneapolis told me, no, we can't call it that. We have to call it something like the Twin Cities Boulevard. But let me introduce my guests. I have Jose from Our Streets. I have Alex from... Alex, are you from Our Streets?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yep.
Both of you from Our Streets. I've prepared very extensively for this episode. And Peggy Sue, returning co-host. And we're here to talk about the Twin Cities Boulevard project, which is this idea as... well, Alex, let's go to you. You explain what the Twin Cities Boulevard project is.
I think in short, the Twin Cities Boulevard is a working community vision to remove I-94 and to reclaim it as a people-centered boulevard that prioritizes reparative investment for surrounding communities.
And why is this project happening now? Explain the Rethinking I-94 project from MnDOT. Like, why are they doing it now? Why are we having this conversation?
Yeah, so that's the part that can get a little tricky because MnDOT has a project with a flashy name that can get confused as our campaign. So MnDOT has actually created this project back in 2015 called the Rethinking I-94 project. And this was created by Charlie Zelle, who at the time was the MnDOT commissioner, now the chair of the Met Council. And kind of this like broad, high-level effort to rethink I-94, I guess, to determine the future of Interstate 94, 15 miles of it in Minneapolis and St. Paul. But the real reason why that project happened and why we're here today is because the interstate is nearing the end of its useful life. So the pavement, the bridges, the retaining walls, all that stuff, it has a lifespan. That lifespan is coming to an end. And now, one way or the other, we as a community and MnDOT has to decide, do we want to rebuild that or do we want to do something else?
I think one way people can relate to it is maybe people who listen to this podcast is maybe the Hennepin Avenue reconstruction. Like the street's been there for a lifetime, and this is our chance to fix it for another lifetime. It's our once in a lifetime opportunity to repair some harms. Jose, can we go to you and talk about what the harms have been historically, and not just historically, but ongoing? There's like a list of things that are very detrimental to the people who live near it and along it. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, and I'll actually start jumping off of the Hennepin reconstruction. I think that it's also a great example of capitalizing on an opportunity that's going to have ramifications for decades, and also setting the tone for how other corridors would be designed around the city. A freeway removal project was also help set the tone for how people understand the possibilities for what we can do with freeways in the future. For example, turning them into boulevards. And part of the reason why we're having this discussion is because initially, as we know, in the Twin Cities and across the country, a lot of these freeway projects were focused on communities that were primarily African American. So that's sort of the first initial like large scale, big picture planning harm, is that 80% of the communities that were removed to make way for freeways like I-94 were African American communities. In addition to that, as you're pointing out, that we've included on our website and on our materials, things like life expectancy are about 5 years less than the city average, I believe. The outliers are really wild. It's up to, I think, 18 years in difference depending on the zip code. Average household income is also significantly less. The asthma rates are also significantly higher. But, in addition to that, when we're talking about these impacts, it's the fact that the freeway takes up quite a bit of land space that we feel like can be returned to the community through public land trust and other things. And so one of the harms we're trying to address is the fact that, there's a whole economy that gets uprooted, when you create a path for a freeway that's that large and that wide that doesn't exist there anymore. And so folks are not just living around the corridor experiencing these harms, but they have less access, or the economy that they ought to have access to is farther away, more difficult to access or get to. And so I think that kind of encompasses, some of the harms that at least we're trying to address as comprehensively as possible.
One of the things that surprised me is, maybe I'm not surprised by it, but I thought was fascinating was there's a large portion of people who live right along the freeway who don't have cars, don't have access to cars. And it's kind of a place where you don't want to live there if you don't have a car. Like it's kind of a miserable thing. And just to put a finer point on your answer, we're talking about air pollution. So it's poison. We're talking about noise. We're talking about the economic impacts of living near an interstate. There's a reason property values are so low. There's a reason people who live along interstates are lower income. Neighborhoods have been decimated by the impact of I-94. Peggy Sue, are you still there? Okay.
I came back. I'm sorry.
Did you hear what I said? The brilliant thing I just said?
I didn't. I'm so sorry.
Okay,
Repeat
well
it,
now you go. It wasn't important. You go.
Yeah, I can just say just an initial thought, just from like a planning perspective, right? Like, I think that we have to also think about just like the chicken or the egg, right? A little bit in terms of like, are all of these things that make these conditions and like the livability here so poor just the highway, or is it also like what's the bigger picture of when people like what housing stock and what communities value next to highways, right? So when you have a big highway like 94 throughout the Twin Cities, right, both in the St. Paul side and the Minneapolis side, what gets put next to that? Because it's kind of an undesirable amenity, right? So this, the history of the Rondo neighborhood is really rich in culture and history, and what was there before was really destroyed and then replaced with, again, just kind of like this really, it's like living next to a factory, right? Like a very toxic factory. The investment that goes in adjacent to that is really, really different than living next to the Stone Arch Bridge, right? Or like a beautiful amenity. And so I think that what you see, and I think what is really important about disrupting the legacy of continuing to have something similar or worse than what's currently there, is also that like it continues that pattern of like disinvestment, right? Like it doesn't, the city isn't putting in the money or in the amenities or the resources of a neighborhood that has a better amenity than being up against a highway. So I think that that's like, and maybe that has changed quite a lot with like the investment around Midway and some of those things. But I do think that you also have this legacy in terms of both just like the devastation caused by routing this freeway system here, and also like lack of investment for years and years and years with housing stock, with services, like the type of at the end of the day, the people who are kind of obligated to live there because of other like environmental or social or economic factors also plays to all of those increased risks, right? Those increased risks of asthma or of like other health issues or whatever, because you're aggregating, a group of people who are already in a scenario where they might not have as much economic mobility or housing choice, right? So I think that there's a much as much as like not to, this is not a devil's advocate argument at all in terms of just like, but thinking about it more broadly too, just from a planning perspective, what happens when you route a highway through a major community is that people who have choice choose to live other places, right? And people who don't have choice are stuck living in these places. And so then those people who don't have choice also don't have choice in lots of areas of their lives, which is why I think you start to see this really, really significant gap that then is worsened by the environmental conditions of living next to a freeway.
Yeah, I think it's a good point that unfortunately in this country, the primary mechanism for, I mean, it's not really intentional in this way, but like the way that affordability is preserved is through disinvestment and like environmental injustice and like a freeway. And so, Jose, maybe if you want to talk a little bit about like the benchmarks part of the vision, but I think like acknowledging that that's the case and incorporating that into this vision is just as important, if not more important, as the transportation component itself, like the boulevard itself. It's really about like bringing that vision to the land use and implementing anti-displacement policies, community benchmarks, and making sure that that's all done in a way that ensures that those residents that have experienced decades of harm by the highway are prioritized through this project, and that the proper policies are in place to ensure that they're the ones who benefit.
I just want to point out there's a weird zoning quirk where a lot of apartment projects happen in like the armpit of an interstate. Like it's a place where cities and suburbs have decided this is undesirable enough that we will put our new multifamily housing near interstates, which I think, like, I support the housing, but I think it's unfortunate that we've decided to zone our cities in such a way that it pushes housing towards lots of dense housing towards freeways. But let's talk about the project itself, because we talked about rethinking I-94, which is the MnDOT broader MnDOT agenda here. And so let's talk about the Twin Cities Boulevard project and what it would bring, how it repairs those harms. Jose?
I'll talk about the benchmarks a little bit, and I know Alex will be better at talking about the actual cross-section of the boulevard, so you get a sense of what it'll feel like visually. One thing I would say for context is that the benchmarks are kind of the outcome of work that we've been doing over the last year. We've all started at Our Streets Minneapolis at different times last year, and trying to kind of bring in this perspective that when we're asking for treatment or transformations or reconstructions, it's going to invite some kind of development. And, as a sort of transportation organization, we wanted to take the step of including policies and benchmarks that accounted for these consequences of, say, a reconstruction. And we learned a lot about that when we started the Olson Memorial Highway Project, the Bring Back Sixth initiative, and how to start talking about those things through our partnership with Harrison Neighborhood Association. And so these benchmarks, sort of broadly speaking, include housing and anti-displacement, obviously public land trusts, both for, creating opportunities for homeowners and commercial land trusts. We're also talking about the actual design, for it to be universal design and making sure that we're accounting for all ages and all abilities. Oftentimes even designs don't account for sort of the spectrum of disabilities that we want to make sure that these designs are accounting for, and we see this as an opportunity to go that far. Labor and business development. We believe that when projects like this come to fruition, even the reconstruction itself can become an opportunity for people to get training and gainful employment opportunities, rather than say the employment come from the outside completely. And business development opportunities, the idea of sort of incubating potential business owners who have some talents or some interests or maybe some concepts that can be developed so that the business corridor itself gets filled in with business owners from the community itself. And amongst a few other things, the other thing that I think is really important to point out is that in the work that we're doing, especially recently, we've been doing a lot of community engagement, and obviously we try to be present in as much as possible that's going on in different projects around the city and now obviously state level. And so we've added some community engagement benchmarks to basically ask MnDOT and other agencies to make sure that they're actually talking to the community and they're able to meaningfully demonstrate that there's broad consent, from a representative majority that's actually impacted by these projects. We felt like it's very difficult for folks to come to sessions and hearings and provide their input, especially working class folks who don't have easy access to those hours when these things are held. But that also, the engagement should be much broader and much more thorough so that people in the community really have the opportunity to input and come up with a direct say on the actual outcome. And so we've put in benchmarks there for a true participatory process, a sort of like a floor level baseline starting point for MnDOT and the other agencies to look at. But yeah, I think that covers a good chunk of them. It's a really great document. We're going to re-emphasize it as the weeks go along, but exactly like Alex was saying, it's just important for us to recognize that we're going to invite changes along the corridor, and we want to make sure those changes benefit the most vulnerable first, and that account for all members of the community along the corridor.
Alex, before we get into talking about the design itself that you're proposing, how many people live along this 7.5 mile corridor? How many people are we poisoning with I-94?
That's a good question.
You haven't done the math? It would be so compelling. It would be so compelling if you could say this many people live along the corridor. For
sure. I have that number, but I can't remember it off the top of my head. But we've done, the answer is like tens of thousands of people, in this broader corridor.
More, even more. Like maybe 100,000. Who knows? Because I think the number is like 15,000 for Hennepin Avenue, and that's only like a mile stretch of road.
Yeah.
I know it's a very dense part of Minneapolis, but it's a
Definitely.
lot of people.
Yeah. I should get that number. If I had a research team, I could have them do that right now.
Here's another idea. How about those pollution maps that they show adjacent to freeways? I did not see that on your website. Is there a pollution map?
There is, actually. Yeah, there's a couple of them, but they're powerful. And yeah, if folks go to twincitiesboulevard.org and go to like the harms section, it outlines the impacts of the freeway, and air quality is obviously a huge part of that story. And one census data that we have dug into, because this is not something that MnDOT obviously likes to put front and center when they're talking about reconstructing their projects. But if you look at the census data, we took all the census tracts from this new project corridor and looked at air quality. And it's 3 times worse. Like I think Jose mentioned that 3 times worse than the level deemed healthy by the MPCA. And another thing that I want to emphasize that you mentioned earlier, John, is like the people most impacted by this project or by the freeway use it the least. Right. And that's not something that gets talked about all the time. I think if you talk to a MnDOT engineer, they'd talk about the freeway as an amenity for accessing like jobs in the suburbs or high frequency commutes and things like that. 28% of the people that live in the census tracts along the corridor do not own a car. That's double the average for Minneapolis and St. Paul and 4 times the regional average for the Twin Cities. So like these people can't afford a car, and yet they're dealing with these really insidious impacts of the freeway every day. And so it's kind of a transition, but talking about the transportation side of things for the boulevard, that's why including other options for getting around, prioritizing folks that have mobility challenges or are transit dependent, like that is front and foremost for recreating this corridor for surrounding communities.
So you're talking about adding transit and a bike route, and it's going to be vastly safer and more pleasant and more accessible if you're using the sidewalks. That's the kind of project we're doing. Peggy Sue.
Well, and I also think just like to kind of build on just the, the role that this freeway plays right in this neighborhood, and for those people who are, inarguably being poisoned, right, by this and having these like extremely negative effects. And there's also been so much investment in terms of like transit in these areas too, right? Like I think that, the green line lines up very well with this. It was part of, I think, the routing strategy for that, right? And there's great bus service, and you have in this corridor, you have quite a few colleges and universities that are having, that number is probably slightly higher than other places because you have McAllister and Concordia and the U and these places where you have these high student populations who aren't driving, in addition to people who are having, cost burdened likely for their housing and choose not to have a vehicle because they have access to really great transportation. And I think that a question, is what role, what service does 94 play, right? Is the service of 94 that you get to Wisconsin, right? And is it a throughway, or is it actually like a means of transportation, right? Is it the argument that this is what
Peggy Sue, if you're still there, I think we lost you.
Oh no!
Peggy Sue has notoriously unreliable internet in her part of North Minneapolis.
I hear that.
Oh, Jose, are you also in North Minneapolis?
Yes.
Ward 4? Ward 5?
I live in Hawthorne.
Do we get the location tags on this podcast?
No, we won't be putting live from Lindale Avenue on you. Alex, do you still live on Lindale Avenue? Are you still monitoring the crash situation there?
I've moved from you're on the ground correspondent, which is a bummer because I feel like the only tweets that ever did any numbers were car crash photos.
Yeah. You sending me, DMing me car crash photos on Lindale Avenue was a popular segment. Not for the people involved in the car crashes, but for viewers.
Always would check and make sure they're okay before capturing the damage. But no, I still live in Whittier, more towards the Eat Street side.
Okay, you have fled from the poison that is Lindale Avenue. But back to Peggy Sue. You were in the middle of talking about something. Do you remember what you were talking about?
I have gotten new internet since we've done this the last time. That was supposed to be better, and it is not better.
Alex, can you not see Peggy Sue?
No.
I'm going to stop the recording.
Okay, sorry. Next time I'm going to do this internet from somewhere else with much more reliable internet. But what I was talking about was just that I think there's a conversation the DOT needs to have around like what is the use, and as a community, like what is the use of 94? Is the use of 94 to get people from North Dakota to Wisconsin, or is the use of 94 actually really intended to bring people to and from places? I don't think it does that, right? Like, I don't think right now it serves as a means for, or a mechanism for, even me going somewhere in St. Paul, right? Like, I think there's a lot of different ways to do that, both in terms of transit or in routing. And so, like, what value does it actually serve us in terms of having this big, giant freeway that goes right through the middle of two, major hubs for a community or for a state? Like, what's the value there? And how much do you value that, right? Like, how much do you value getting trucks, from North Dakota to Wisconsin versus, really having good investments that allow people to get, to and from, jobs or school or, the grocery store. And I think that that's a question that MnDOT really needs to assess and value. How much do we care about this space being something that's actually a community asset rather than it being like a throughway?
Yeah, for sure. And I think we're clear on like where we stand on that, which is that this should serve the communities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. And I don't want to take it too far back, but when we think about like the concept of urban freeways to begin with, and this whole thing, like it was a ploy to get people to buy more cars. And, like to decimate communities and push out Black communities and communities of color, and like as a tool of urban renewal. But like from a main driver of the concept of creating freeways in cities was pushed by like General Motors at the World's Fair in like the middle of the 20th century. And they had this exhibit that you could come in, and it's kind of like It's a Small World if you've ever been to like Disney World, but it was like Freeway World, and it was like the city of the future, and it was all these freeways like 20 lanes wide, and it was like traffic is eliminated. This is amazing. You can get everywhere you need to go. I think a question we also need to ask ourselves, and we can talk about this more, but is this working? Have these ever worked from a transportation standpoint? Do we ever see the reduction in traffic like is promised? Like, have we seen that on 35W even before workers have come back to downtown? No, we never do. So these things don't even work to do the things that they've proclaimed to do. And the laundry list of harms is like 10 times the benefit.
And every solution to fix them doesn't fix it, right? Because it's just inevitably like a problem, right? Like every time you try to add a lane or create even like a min pass system, right? Like all it does is either like widen the gap of inequities or just create more traffic. Like there's no solution to making them better. Like they inevitably are like unfixable.
If we were going to do it right, we would have like a mile-wide poison buffer to either side, right? Like if we cared about people, and that doesn't seem like someone said earlier. I don't know who said this. Maybe it was Peggy Sue. That it's a factory. It's a polluting factory use. Basically, is how we need to think of it, and it doesn't belong where it is. It was a mistake to put it there. It's and if you don't want to think about it in environmental justice and racial justice terms, it's a huge missed economic opportunity. Like route people through, some rural part of the state where the poison has less impact, and let's do something that can serve the people who actually live in cities.
Well, and I think it's like a huge ethical quandary, right? That we're asking people thinking about this to make, right? Is like, is your desire to take 94 from Minneapolis to St. Paul and end up at CHS Field or whatever by car, is it worth it, right? Is it worth poisoning hundreds of thousands of people? And like, because that's the counter argument, is just like, what else? Like, how else do you get there? How else do you maintain the quickness of getting somewhere, right? And I think a lot of people have a hard time, like, I don't think people see it in that comparison, right? Of like, oh, if I choose to make this trip this way, if I choose to continue supporting a highway this way, like I'm also contributing to that factor.
One thing I want to highlight is, I mean, that's true, that there those trips have consequences. But what we really are trying to do with the Twin Cities Boulevard is we're not, I want to emphasize, like, we're not talking about just removing the freeway and like creating a vacuum. Like talking about, I guess I didn't really talk about like the boulevard portion of it, but we want to make sure that folks can get where they need to go, and that this isn't like everyone like bearing a huge pain and kind of like making a big sacrifice for the well-being of the surrounding communities. Like everyone needs to get to where they need to go. And like the people that have cars, like they drive on it because, it saves them a couple minutes, or Google Maps routes them on it. Like we need to make sure that people have transportation options. So with the boulevard, like some elements that could, or like would be included in that would be like, people would still be able to drive. I think that's really important. Like there would still be multiple lanes of traffic to move.
I'm so reassured, Alex. You've reassured me. Multiple lanes of car traffic still?
Multiple lanes of car traffic. Well, here's the thing.
That's something
like,
for everyone.
Even on the smallest segments of the I-94 trench, it's like a football field long. And in some places, it's much bigger. which means you have the opportunity, like the community really has the opportunity to make it what it wants. But like, what are some things you could do with that? You could have multiple lanes of car traffic to accommodate that. And we can talk about traffic later because that's a common question as well. But bus rapid transit, dedicated lane, electric buses. Our vision includes zero fare transit, like connecting Minneapolis and St. Paul and all the neighborhoods in between. 2 bikeways are included in the image that we show, again, to just show people what's possible, but like basically like bike highways, again, that would accommodate some of the different trips. And then you could have linear park space, you could have space for, community space. We included a basketball hoop in the rendering because that's something that could fit. Like this corridor, the boulevard really does provide an option to accommodate all the different transportation modes, so that like we can invest in environmental justice and health equity without having people stuck in traffic like 24/7. This both improves mobility and health outcomes and racial equity and our other programs.
I was once on a Interstate 94 in St. Paul. I think it was may have been a protest. I'm vaguely aware of having been on it as like a person on foot. It's huge. It's massive. I don't know if people understand the scale of it unless they've walked over one of the bridges or like been on it and like stood there. It's so massive. There is space for literally everything, and we've devoted it all to cars. Did you say it was like as wide as a football field? Is that what you said?
Yeah, and that's in like the portion of the rendering that was shown in Seward, by like Seward Towered West. That's a football field, but in some places, like in St. Paul, it's a lot wider too.
It's so massive.
I have maybe a technical question, and maybe this can just pivot around to how this might function, right? So what you're proposing is something that is bigger. That I feel like I'm the negative Nancy on this. How did I end up on this side of things, right? So what you're proposing is beyond the scope of the Minnesota Department of Transportation, right? So MnDOT is a transportation organization. They are not a land developer, right? They are not even anywhere near, like if they build a cap, right? The development of that land is so far beyond the scope of MnDOT. So can you talk about just like the mechanism, how you've thought about that playing out in terms of like, okay, we build and we create all of this excess, land here to be developed in a variety of ways through a lot of what sounds like a lot of partnerships, right? Through Metro Transit having buses, through developing, affordable commercial space and housing and park space. So can you talk about how you guys envision that mechanism working?
Well, first of all, I want to emphasize that the Twin Cities Boulevard is not a freeway cap, which is a distinction that we're just trying to make in terms of we're talking about like freeway removal, but also it's a great question because that's something that we hear from the agencies a lot. Like it's a common practice to like silo organizations and responsibilities for agencies to deflect responsibility for these broader issues. And we recognize that like the MnDOT, is the major player in this, but there's a lot of other partners at the table. And I think like the biggest thing I want to emphasize is like it was a multi-agency effort to build the freeway and to tear out these communities. And they work together just fine to get that done. We feel like it's totally within reason to ask them to work together to repair these harms. And there's lots of other examples across the country of similar projects. But yeah, I guess that's how I would respond.
Peggy Sue, I'm going to go real quick before you. There's a similar dynamic with like, are people who make decisions about transit taking the bus? Are they taking the train? Like, are people making decisions about I-94 living near I-94? I don't know. It's something that occurred to me.
Just to make a point to tie a couple of things together, it's part of what Alex was saying, and I want to highlight it just a little bit differently, is that this in a way isn't a transportation issue, it's a class issue. And so part of the reason, we don't necessarily go into the community talking about just transportation is because we realize that a lot of the harms that have happened put the community in such a position that they don't have time to consider global climate impacts or freeway harms in terms of health impacts. And most times, the first question is, what's going to happen to where I live? And so we've taken a lot of care in developing a program and a campaign that isn't just like comprehensively covering a lot of the issues that obviously the interstate, the freeway has brought to the community, but also I know that you're very familiar with Raquel, who's our community engagement specialist and leading this charge. It gives us the opportunity to talk to communities in a way that is going to connect and resonate with them. At Our Street Minneapolis, we realized that a lot of the folks who have been really avid supporters of what we do, they care a lot about transportation. But sometimes when you get into spaces where people are really struggling economically, the kitchen table issues have to take precedent. And so we're trying to figure out ways to talk about these things comprehensively and be flexible and pliable enough as an organizing team and as a phone banking team and as an advocacy team to make sure that we can speak to the different priorities that people are struggling with so that the entry point into understanding the boulevard is whatever they're struggling with the most, whatever is it that they want to talk about first. And I think that's ultimately what's going to get this sort of to the finish line. There's just going to be folks that won't really understand climate, but they'll understand health. Won't understand business development, but they'll understand housing. And so that's what I want to say about that. It's just like, it's important for us in transportation, not just to recognize the ramifications, but understand that people have different degrees of understanding. And we just have sort of taken it on ourselves to make sure that we can have those conversations as amicably as possible and as openly as possible. And so what you'll see in the future, when we start door knocking on Saturday and moving forward, is that we'll be able to talk about the land bridge. We'll be able to talk about the impacts and the ramifications. Sometimes we need to be able to talk about accessibility and universal design and how that works. But we also need to learn to talk a little bit about housing, and we need to talk about land use and labor opportunities. And the same thing, we are trying to open the door to make sure that the history that we are aware of gets filled in through this engagement. There's going to be lots of elders that we're going to have an opportunity to engage through some of the community organizations we're going to be talking to. We want to amplify those stories so that people understand the harm from the point of view of a person who actually lives there or has been there for more than one generation or maybe was displaced, so that people start grounding their notion of what the highway is and the harms that it's created on actual lived everyday experiences that are, coming from the community itself.
Yeah, I think that's really important. That's why I tend to shy away from making climate arguments about street reconstructions and trying to connect it to people's neighborhoods. You are going to be happier and healthier and enjoy your existence in your neighborhood more for having remediated this huge transportation issue that we've created and pollution issue.
One more thing I would add, because we've been having conversations all day today, Alex and I, is that we just never felt like this would work if we didn't have a clear, well-constructed vision. It's important for us to think of it as an opportunity to bring our expertise to the communities so that they can see themselves somewhere better and they can understand how is it that life can change through a project like this. But we have to make sure, as folks who are in transportation policy and advocacy, to bring something that's actually plausible, so that then we can make a clear argument like, all you got to do is send an email or volunteer. If you take these action steps, you're actually buying into something that is plausible, that's doable. And so we take a lot of care in the work that we do, both to present it as a living, growing thing, but also get people to buy into something that's done with a serious amount of integrity and care. So that comprehensive coverage that we do across the issues and the way we bring the project forward is definitely rooted in just like the fundamentals of empathy. We want people to buy into and take action on something that's actually going to have an impact on their lives, so that they can see themselves and future generations having something to look forward to that's going to have direct impact on them. And so that kind of ties into the idea of making sure that we identify what is it that would trigger them to feel connected to the project. And so if sometimes it's housing, and sometimes it's business development opportunities, that's fine, but we help them build a connection to the project, and then they feel like they're coming into the project and feeling like they're part of something bigger and that they're supported by their community. And us as an organization with some expertise, we just our willingness to amplify their voices.
I really appreciate that. I think that that's one thing that I really like about our streets as like an organization too, is that like when you get an email from our streets, it's very clear like what the ask is, right? Like what you can do to advance something. And I really like that. I think I have a clarifying question kind of going backwards, which is, I guess I misstated this as like a land bridge or like a freeway cap, right? So, this is clearly something I could have done a little more research today. But I'm wondering if you can articulate the difference in what our streets is kind of advocating for, or what like Reconnect Rondo is advocating for, and like how those are the same or different, or how those interplay. Because I think that there are a lot of organizations here, and I think that was witnessed, and we didn't really talk about this, by like literally like every advocacy organization being like, MnDOT, this sucks, like, releasing that letter, earlier last year of saying like, we kind of all of us are aligned, we don't like what you've proposed so far. So I'm wondering if you can talk about just kind of those two different efforts.
About the difference between like a land bridge and a freeway removal or a highway to boulevard conversion. In like a land bridge is also known as a freeway cap or a lid, like a structure that's built over a sunken freeway, which I-94 is, like a trench. And oftentimes it includes some green space, like some trees. And then sometimes the really fancy ones can have some space for buildings. And but a lot of times there'll be like a few blocks, like a block or two, sometimes like up to 5 blocks. But they're really primarily a mitigation strategy for the freeway itself. So they help to rein in some of the noise. They create some new building opportunities potentially like on that space that's created, and they make it easier to cross. And then, that's about the impact of the freeway lid itself. Our streets and the Twin Cities Boulevard vision is very firm, and we believe that rethinking I-94 needs to mean removing I-94. Like, we need to move on from the freeway, and we need to tackle its impacts head on. And the only way to do that is by removing the freeway. And so a highway to boulevard conversion doesn't just cap a small segment of the freeway, but it restores the trench to at grade, removes the freeway and then replaces it with return land to the community and a boulevard running through it, like what used to exist. And so, and I'll let you articulate this as well, but I think in terms of the difference between the Twin Cities Boulevard and Reconnect Rondo, like, we want to like both affirm and uplift the vision of Reconnect Rondo for reconnecting the Rondo community and for bringing reparative investment to Rondo residents, particularly Black residents and descendants that are at the epicenter of the tragedy that like the construction of I-94 was, and have dealt with those impacts every day. Like their vision of an African-American community enterprise district, creating wealth building opportunities for those residents, very much the same as the Twin Cities Boulevard vision. And like, we're being very intentional about like making space and for that and uplifting that. because the future of the Rondo community should be decided by Rondo community members. Now, the difference is in the vision is that, again, we feel like our vision, the Twin Cities Boulevard vision, is for a highway to boulevard conversion and not a land bridge. So oftentimes, in all circumstances that I've ever seen, a land bridge has been constructed with a reconstructed or expanded freeway underneath it. It doesn't really make sense to mitigate something that's not harmful. Like it just, the land bridges are like $500 million plus. And so I think the path forward is finding a way. For our vision, we want to bring that vision to the entire corridor. We want to repair all of the harms, and we want to make sure that we're not rebuilding the freeway for another 75 years.
To summarize, this is a 7.5 mile stretch of poison disaster that's destroyed neighborhoods, and you want to remove the whole thing. You don't want to cover up 4 blocks of it. Remove the whole thing. That's what it is. Fill it in with dirt. Remove it.
And I would add, for Peggy Sue and folks listening, that we have some graphics making the comparison on the website. So for folks, they can go back to the website and engage with it calmly. And the other thing is, just to say it sort of casually, that the trench gets filled in. So you basically leveling off both sides. And so the other thing is that not only is it highway expansion, a freeway lid, a cap, does not eliminate all of the harms, whereas the boulevard itself would really tackle a far wider spectrum of harms. So if you just cap, create the Rondo Bridge or any other freeway cap, a lot of those harms that are coming from the freeway would still remain. And so we're both saying, this keeps the harms in place, and also this reparative justice vision obviously ought to cover the entire length of the corridor. And so we, one thing that we've said is that we feel inspired by the conceptual vision of the Reconnect Rondo in terms of creating an opportunity for Black Americans that were seriously harmed and the generations of folks that live there. And based on what we learned from working on the north side and obviously our own expertise and partnerships, we feel like concepts like that should just be applied to the whole corridor so everyone gets to benefit.
I have a process question. Who makes this decision? Is it just a MnDOT thing? Like they decide what happens here? Is there a legislative role? Is a role for the governor? Like who's the decision maker?
It's a little bit of everyone, which makes this kind of a beast, but that's just the nature of federal interstates. I'd say MnDOT is the primary decision maker because they're the ones like steering the ship, but there's also input from the Federal Highways Administration. And then I would say like outside of that, you have all the elected decision makers that like freeways, and especially like freeway removal efforts are like always inherently political. And I think like it's honestly, I think it's really energizing to know that the like people do have control over this. Like when I think about MnDOT, at least I think about this giant bureaucracy that's like not transparent and is very inaccessible, and it's like this freeway building machine that's impossible to slow down. But I think it's important to remind people that especially on a project level basis, the Minnesota legislature has to fund this project. Members of Congress need to fund their portion of this project. Both the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul need to sign off on municipal consent for this project. The Met Council needs to determine what happens for transit. Hennepin County would fund transit or whatever happens here. And, and all those things. So like this project is more accessible than it seems. And that's a big part of what we're trying to do as well, is just like kind of sort through that and plug people along the corridor into this decision-making process so that they can see their vision in it and really get excited and expand their imagination about what's possible. But like really just to remind them like that they do have a say in this, and MnDOT is going to do ultimately what the people tell them to do. And so that's what we're focused on.
So I hear your answer that it's a big complicated thing, and there's a whole bunch of levels of government responsible. I just want like how are we attacking this? Are you convincing the city governments to withhold municipal consent and say no, we're not having anything other than a removal? Like what's the political strategy to make this happen? Because I'm not optimistic that anyone outside of the Twin Cities or Minneapolis and St. Paul in particular cares at all about this and will be very highly skeptical, won't want to do it. They're going to say no. So what's the strategy?
I'll leave that for our advocacy director.
The answer to that is broad community consent. And that's where Raquel and our organizing team comes in. We make a decision to create a positive vision intentionally so that we're not just naming the problem, we're addressing it with a solution that people can buy into. And then we go get that consent and we bring that consent to everyone's doorstep. So that's what Peggy Sue was talking about earlier. We make that part of the process really accessible. We create pressure, we funnel that pressure, and we give people things to do through action steps, and then we just go find them. We try to door knock as many neighborhoods as possible. We do a good social media campaign. We have printed literature. We bring the vision to the community in as many ways possible, and every step that they take, all of these decision makers start to hear from it. And to give you an example, with the Bring Back Sixth effort, we got a letter from MnDOT making some initial acknowledgments and commitments, and they actually mentioned doing turnbacks, which is something they weren't talking about a few years ago. Like, that agency is now talking about freeway removal internally, and they're talking about freeway removal publicly. And the other thing that we do, just sort of as a matter of discipline, and since you've engaged with our streets, you know this, especially since I've started last May, we ask for all of these commitments to be made publicly so that we make sure that our elected officials and our decision makers are engaging directly with the community through public commitments. And in the letters that we send and the communications that we have with them, we let them know that we're going to continue to organize until these commitments are made. So it's about taking a social movement model and sort of refining it and funneling it and then bringing it to the communities. And in fact, we're now sort of fully staffed as an organizing program. We're going to have a lead organizer just for this project, for the Hennepin project, for Bring Back Sixth. Raquel's going to be leading that team, and we're also going to start a phone banking program where we're going to make sure that people are just calling in, leaving messages, on top of sending emails and doing the door knocks. And eventually the theory, just like with the Lindell commitment that we got, the Lowry commitment that we got, the preliminary commitment we got around Bring Back Sixth, this type of pressure and this type of intensity and tenacity, this is how I say it to the team, is self-fortification. We have to be able to project self-fortification and send the message that this campaign is going to continue until the demands are met and the commitments are made publicly. And we live up to that expectation. We just carry on until it's done. And while we do that, we make sure that the feedback that we're getting helps us inform the kind of renderings that we're doing, helps us inform the way we go back and talk about things. So there isn't a simple answer, but it is basically conceptually a public social movement effort that we make, and we just make and keep the promise to keep it up until the job is done, the commitments are made. But then at some point, it's up to the agencies to roll out the policies and make the investments and make sure that things start to move forward. And so right now we're just getting started, but that's what we're pushing for.
Alex, can I get you to give me a soundbite about how electric cars are still polluting you? Do you have a quick soundbite on that? Can you trash electric cars here for me?
Absolutely. Happy to dunk on them. Yeah. I mean, that's a common question that gets brought up. Like, why are we worried about air pollution along freeways? Electric cars are going to solve that problem. And don't take my word for it. Take the MPCA's word, or the EPA's word for it. Like, first of all, only like 1.5% of cars in Minnesota are electric. And that number is only going up by like maybe 2 to 3% every year. And the average car age is like 14 years. So it's going to take decades to get to a point where all the cars, let alone trucks, which that process hasn't even started, are electrified. But even if they are electrified, and I wish I don't take a lot of joy in this. Like it's unfortunate, but the reality is that electric cars are a lot heavier, and a lot of the air pollution, like PM 2.5 or like fine particulate matter, some of the stuff that's like really tiny and can get into your bloodstream and your lungs really easy, that stuff comes from tire wear and tear and like the asphalt getting torn up. And the heavier that the vehicle is, the more that happens. So there's some pollutants like PM 2.5, some of the nastiest ones, that actually get worse with electric vehicles. And I am not like an EV truther. Like I
Is that a thing? I want to join. Is there such a thing as an EV truther?
I'm not trying to say, I guess what I'm trying to say is like, obviously I know electrification is important. I know the benefits for both climate and public health, but it's not going to make this problem go away. And
you mentioned tire particles. You left out brake dust.
Yeah, brake dust. That's what I was going to say.
Yes,
also important.
Some low hanging fruit there. Missed that, but yes, absolutely. I think, that's really important for people to know. I think MnDOT should be telling folks that in the same sentence that they're talking about the benefits of electric.
You can have electric car chargers on the boulevard. That comes up a lot on Hennepin Avenue. You're gonna put a bunch of those in your renderings.
Yeah, we can work on that for sure.
Okay, Peggy Sue.
Well, I'll just also say, like, in terms of just like vehicles, right? Like, vehicles require roads, right? And roads are impervious surface, and impervious surfaces are hot. And so, like, that is also like the logic when we talk about like EVs. Like, that's not a solution for a warming planet, right? Like, our planet is warming. When we have like large amounts of impervious surface, like extreme heat conditions are just as bad as like particulate matter, right? Like, and for people who have, respiratory conditions or heart conditions or like are sensitive to high heat events, like that's just as bad to like continue maintaining massive areas of pavement and impervious surface. And so that's a really important distinction too when we talk about like we still require roads, right? Like if we continue everything the exact same but we switch to EV, we didn't reduce any of the like extremely high heat situations that a lot of urban cities suffer from, right? Where we have a large lack of green space, a lack of tree canopy in Minnesota, where we're seeing huge amounts of like ash destroyed because of EAB, right? So we have even decreased further tree canopy. Like the switching the mode of vehicle doesn't necessarily help in a situation where you're in a very urban environment that it's very hot and getting hotter.
I think
Jose, wait, Alex, I'm the host. Jose, so you scolded me about calling this episode The War on 94. I'm thinking maybe the EV Truther Roundtable. What do you think about that one?
I'm actually all for that. I absolutely am all for that. So I appreciate that. And
like, to be clear, like the things, the choices that you make, like in terms of like reducing like petroleum, right, is like that's ultimately like also like a very good choice to make. And like it's not about shaming people from this choice, right? Like if I had to buy a new car, I probably would buy something that is like a hybrid or an EV because I would want to make a choice that's not the current vehicle that I have. But I think it's also just important to talk about it in like in a bigger bucket of context.
Yeah, your car is still poisoning me.
Electric vehicles are super expensive, and a lot, like we talked about, a lot of folks can't even afford a car, let alone an electric vehicle.
Or they can afford a 20-year-old gas car. The used car market is crazy, and people are buying very, very old cars because cars are expensive, more expensive than ever. I don't know. Go ahead, Alex. What did you want to say?
The last thing I'll say is this is like on the more in the global context, but I think it's important because I actually had someone who's been really interested in this project, and they emailed me an article about this new proposed copper nickel mine in northern Minnesota. It's a Tesla mine. So Tesla has like claimed like 60% of the minerals that are coming from it. And it's important to remember, like, just the minerals alone, like we cannot, this planet cannot handle a world where everyone drives an electric vehicle. And it's obviously going to impact places like the Boundary Waters and like these places that we hold precious in the state, but also it just continues this cycle of like extractive capitalism in the global South, and a lot of these islands, like in the South Pacific, that are really rich with these minerals, are being decimated in the name of like greenwashed capitalism for electric vehicle batteries. Like I think it's just and anyways, this person emailed me this and was like, as a Tesla owner, like this clicked. Like I understand why we need to.
Those emails hardly ever end well.
No, right. A suburban Tesla owner, nonetheless. And it was like, yes, it helped for me.
Yeah, something that we haven't said too much, just to say it out loud, is that part of what the Twin Cities Boulevard implies and starts to get into is that in Minneapolis and in the Twin Cities, areas where amenities and essential services are walkable and bikeable are often much more affluent. And part of what we're trying to sort of bring and offer to Northsiders here, as we know, some things are really far away, is that to all communities. And I think this is a great example, along with the one on Also Memorial Highway, is that to deal with this climate crisis and deal with these health issues, part of the solution is to make sure that amenities and essential services are within reach. And that is a very easy class issue to bring to the communities. When you talk to folks that are in areas that are really devastated, they often just talk about the fact that their travel time is just so time consuming, and it takes away value from their lives to have to spend so much time traveling. And so the Boulevard, in a way, addresses all of these things all at once, because the amenities and the proposed amenities would be built in to the communities themselves. So they would benefit economically, both from gainful employment or business development opportunities, but also just having easy, walkable, bikeable access.
And again, I know I've said this before, but if you don't care about racism, environmental justice, you don't care about those things, you're a terrible person. Think of it in terms of economic development. All this land that will be created. And I know you guys have thought about protecting the area from gentrification, because when you make a place nicer, gentrification tends to follow. And so I know we've been going on a really long time. I want to talk about traffic, because people are going to ask where are all these cars going to go? This is not realistic at all. All these cars, you take out the freeway, we're still going to have cars. Some of them will be electric. This is not a practical solution. So Alex?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, because that's definitely the most common question I think we get. And I'm going to start by throwing out two terms for your listeners: induced demand and traffic evaporation. If we can remember anything in regards to traffic, I think it's those two terms. And also, I'll add another quote from The Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come, they being cars. So in terms of a freeway, because of induced demand, the easier we make it to drive, the more DOT adds lanes to a freeway, the more people drive. And it just ends up with this never-ending cycle of freeway expansion. We like to refer to it as the freeway industrial complex, that we pour hundreds of millions of public dollars into these projects that don't work. And I think I've never been, but if you ever go to Houston, An example we like to highlight is the widest freeway in North America, the Katy Expressway, which is 26 lanes. And it was expanded to 26 lanes in 2011 at the cost of like $2.5 billion. 3 years later, traffic was worse than before the project started. And so it just doesn't work. Freeway expansion does not work. On the reverse side of that, though, traffic evaporation, we know that when you take away those lanes and instead invest in things like walking, biking, transit, other ways for folks to get around, you start doing the things that Jose said, like bringing those amenities and those basic needs back into the community so that they don't have to drive to, White Bear Lake or Roseville or whatever to like these big box office stores, but they have it in their community. The opposite happens and traffic goes away. So with the Twin Cities Boulevard proposal, we're looking at shifting transportation habits, shifting access to the reason that people take those trips, and not like eliminating trips, but making those trips shorter and in a different mode. And it like, don't take my word for it. Like you can look at every other example where a freeway was intentionally removed, or like a bridge collapsed, or like an earthquake happened or something. Like people find other ways to get around. And that's especially the case when you're intentional about creating these new transportation modes. So I think like people are always still a little skeptical about that. And those things are counterintuitive, to be honest. I don't know if I believed it the first time I heard that, but when you really look into the data, that's the case.
It sounds like propaganda, but when you think about it, our car-based transportation system is so overbuilt, and you might say resilient, that you can remove pieces of it, and there are many options for how you can continue driving. No one's trying to take you out of your car. You can continue driving, just maybe not so many of you driving directly through a dense urban area that has been polluted for many decades. Maybe stop doing that.
And I think people want those amenities, right? Like people want to be adjacent, like people want the 15-minute city, right? Like people want to be able to go to their nearest grocery store. They want to be able to go to their nearest eye doctor, right? Like they want all of those things in a really even people who drive as their primary mode of transportation want to drive the shortest amount, right? And so I think the more that we continue to reduce that for folks, across the board, the more that you reduce, vehicle miles traveled. Like if I could walk to a coffee shop every single day, I would be so poor. I would buy all the coffee there, and my coffee machine would never be used, right? And so I think that logic, I think, extends to a lot of our daily goods and services, where I think of our most affluent neighborhoods, right? Like think about 50th and France and like the property values around those neighborhoods and like the level of amenities there, and why people choose to live there, right? I think that is, our historic main streets, right? Where people have these wonderful walkable lives. I think people want that, and people prefer not to drive even when driving is how they typically get around.
Yeah, we believe like everyone should have access to that, and it shouldn't just be like something that people can purchase with like expensive property or expensive rents. And like the last thing I'll add to that is I think this is a working vision again, and will continue to evolve with community input. But when people look at the rendering and like the cross section of the Twin Cities Boulevard, I think it's like we were very intentional, like Jose said, like we wanted to bring something that was plausible. So like we didn't just pay our streets did not just like find like a graphic design student at the U to like create something that like looked cool. Like we were very intentional about working with folks that have designed like 30 highway removal projects over the course of their career, so that they'd be like, this will work. Like it will work. Like traffic will not be in Armageddon, like backed up in neighborhoods. That's a concern that happens every time. And it's gone in like 2 weeks. And, for San Francisco, great example, earthquake took that highway down right by the ferry building. They called it the Monster, and they decided not to rebuild it because it was going to be super expensive, and traffic was totally fine. And that thing carried like more cars than I-94 does. So the lessons are in history.
Here's a gotcha question: Who is funding you? Who's the pedestrian lobby, the bike lobby? Who is funding this effort? Who stands to benefit? Who's paying your bills? Who paid for your graphic design?
I'll say, do you want to?
It seems that I've stumped you both. This has been a good
funders are
gotcha
listed
question.
on the website, but I don't remember it. I know it's who are the two funders? McKnight and what's the other one?
Yeah, McKnight provides like general operating support for our streets, and then for the rendering itself, it was actually the Seed Fund, which like I should learn more about this.
It was a joke question. It's not that.
Is it the clean energy resource teams funding?
I think it could be, yeah. Like they provide like small grants that serve like kind of like a catalyst for like bigger movements. So that was really helpful in securing the funding we needed. Just to like we knew that showing people what's possible is so much more important than telling them. And so
I'm sorry for dragging this out so long. Have you been getting any negative feedback? Any conspiracy theorists asking the who funds you question, or has it been a positive reception so far?
I think I think most of the reception has been super positive. I have seen some folks that like on Twitter were like that were confused and like said MnDOT was proposing the Twin Cities Boulevard, which I think we want to clarify. Like that is not, that's our goal eventually, but not the case right now.
Anytime you do a rendering, everyone assumes that it's like a rendering from a government agency. The thing with Hennepin Avenue, like a rendering from Hennepin for People, which is just a group of neighbors, was posted to Reddit, and it's like, look what the city's proposing. It's like, no, we wish they were proposing this, and maybe they will be, but that rendering's not from the city.
That's the like planning 101 is like never release a rendering you're not ready for people to have like an attachment to. Because if you show a rendering too early, it
lives forever.
People are like, well, it doesn't look like the picture, and they get all up in arms.
The thing with the Minneapolis 2040 plan, all the like sample buildings were white and colorless and very nondescript, and people were like, "You're gonna replace my house with a white box." No color, no windows.
Yeah, people lack imagination.
Well, we thought about it. What Alex is saying is completely true. That like we're very careful about making sure that it was plausible. But just from the organizing side, I couldn't say this enough times. When we started, say we were working on the Lindale project, we just have these small little 2-dimensional graphics that was like, here's what the lanes could look like, etc. And it raised some questions, and I really love what Peggy Sue just said, because that's exactly what I'm after when I think about conceptualizing advocacy programs, is planting a seed that catches fire all on its own. The 10 of us as a team will be able to reach community members on a very consistent basis, but the true power of this campaign is offering something that just catches fire on its own. And then we're talking social movement level, when people are just talking about it. And the best place to start is with an engaging image, Yeah. And so that sort of forces MnDOT to kind of respond to something that people are now holding on to visually.
You know what I want to see? I want to see like an overhead aerial view of the massive trench and like what that could be. Because I liked the close-up thing with the slider where you could see, just slide it from one direction to the other. You could see before or after really quick. I want to see an aerial view just to capture this massive waste of space that we've turned into a big polluting car infrastructure thing.
You just wait. There's more. Like we're definitely going to continue to build on.
You want it to catch fire on Reddit. That's what you want. You want people on Reddit to say, look what MnDOT's planning to do to our city. That's what you want.
Well, yeah, I think that's well taken. We do have plans for future renderings, and yeah, I think the thing I just want to emphasize, and it kind of goes back to the question of like, what's some of the pushback that we've gotten? The only other negative reception I think I've seen is from people that I either know or just strangers that I don't know that are like, they seem to like the idea and they understand its value, but they just can't seem to bring themselves to accept that it's possible or like that. And I just cannot emphasize this enough. Like, this vision is possible. Jose and I would be crazy for spending the amount of time we spend on this thing if we didn't believe that. And it is. And I just cannot emphasize that enough. Like, if people find this vision to be compelling and they see the benefits of it, then, let yourself have good things. Like let's take advantage of this opportunity and make the most of it, because, it only comes once every 75 years.
I find it very compelling. I may be one of those people who thinks this could never happen. This is too fantastic, but it makes intellectual sense. It's very compelling. I lack the imagination to imagine that other people have the imagination to let this happen, because it is good from an economic sense, from a not poisoning people sense, from all the senses.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's just hard, right? Like, I think sometimes these are just like, there's such overwhelming and big issues that people have a hard time imagining like the better future, right? And you have to build that for people really piece by piece, right? Like, when you talk about this project, you're talking about a ton of partners, a ton of stakeholders, a ton of elected officials, both here and at the federal level. And that is like, even as someone who really cares about this, project and this issue, feels really overwhelming. Like, how do you convince that many people? And I think that is like the biggest, that's the real challenge here, is like selling people that it's possible and that it's like, you can imagine a different future. And I can see that being a really tough hump to get over, right? In terms of really convincing people that what you're proposing is rooted in reality and is possible.
Does anyone have a call to action? Tell people what you want them to do to support this, to make it happen, a plug for the website.
So you can sign up to volunteer. There is a survey that people are filling out to let us know what their vision is. There is a petition that you can sign, and all decision makers get notified when you sign that petition. And there's also an email. You just click, it's pre-filled, and you can send, and decision makers will receive it.
All of those are listed twincitiesboulevard.org under the Get Involved section. But yeah, petition, sending an email, sign our volunteer form. It's not just going to be this Saturday. We'll be out in the community all the time. And that's what I was going to say. And I think you were going to say that too, Jose, to your earlier point, Peggy Sue, like, how do we do this? One door at a time. And, for folks that are fired up about this or interested, we would love their help.
Okay, that'll do it. I don't know how long we've been talking about this, but hopefully people listen to the end. I have a problem creating well-structured, brief podcast episodes, but I had fun. Thank you all. Thank you all for joining me. I'm going to do last names this time. My co-host has been Peggy Sue Amihi, Jose Zayas Caban from Our Streets, Alex Burns from Our Streets. I'm your host, John Edwards, and this has been the Wedge Live Podcast. Thank you for listening.
This is a real thing. Real thing.
None of you have the balls to stop this. Stop this.
I've got plenty of time. I have nothing else going on today.
We're in the Wedge neighborhood right now.